This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. A casual glance at current events makes North Carolina look like the petri dish for environmental concerns. Coal ash would top the list, one supposes, as conversations continue over exactly what to do with the tons of waste that has resulted from a century of coal power generation and about just how dangerous it is. Then there is the Atlantic Coast Pipeline that energy companies want in order to deliver fracked natural gas to this region from West Virginia. Trouble is that pipeline would have to cross through national forests and even the Appalachian Trail, and late last year a federal court invalidated a permit allowing that $7 billion project to be built through what many consider sacred ground. It's just the latest delay, so now what? And when it comes to clean power generation, there's the question of solar rebates for installing solar panels. Are they available or not? This hour, we look into these and other environmental issues in North Carolina with three people who follow them closely. One is WFAE's environmental reporter David Borax. He is in our studio along with Brandon Jones, the new Catawba Riverkeeper, who was appointed in November and who takes over from Sam Perkins. Welcome to you both. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to be here.
Nice to have you. And with us from the studios of WUNC in Durham is Lisa Sorg, an environmental reporter for NC Policy Watch. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks a lot. Good morning.
Good morning. And if you'd like to join our conversation, you can email us at charlottetalks@wfae.org. Search for WFAE on Facebook. Get to us through Twitter at Charlotte Talks. You can even watch three of us on Facebook Live this morning. Brandon, I'm going to start with you because you were named, this was news to me yesterday. I didn't know that Sam was gone, but you were named the new Catawba Riverkeeper in November. Sam Perkins had been in that job since 2013, many times on this program. But for the past 15 months, you've been serving as the organization's Director of Technical Programs, which has been described as kind of an understudy for the job you have now?
Yes. Yeah, I pretty much covered anything that Sam couldn't get to. We divided up all of our issues in the basin, and then also is education outreach.
So how do you see this job, Catawba Riverkeeper?
I'd like to say that it's kind of like the Lorax and try and speak for the river as best I can. But there are a lot of issues, and we have limited resources, so oftentimes it's more like triage, and we just try and do the best we can to protect the river and the people that use it, which is all of us.
And your background is?
Grew up in Gastonia. Spent a good amount of time on Lake Wylie, then undergrad at Chapel Hill, and then grad school at UNC Charlotte.
In environmental work or some other field?
Yes, environmental science.
Okay. Well, welcome. We'll be talking about a lot of things that concern you then in this hour. Last January, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was approved by state regulators, but by year's end, it hit another of several snags along the way. So, David, remind people what this pipeline is supposed to do and why it has become so controversial.
Well, a group of energy companies led by Dominion Energy of Virginia with partners including Duke Energy and the Southern Company of Atlanta are spending about $7 billion to build this 600-mile pipeline, which will go from West Virginia through Virginia to eastern North Carolina. Up there in West Virginia are fracking wells that are pulling gas up out of the ground, and they want to get that gas to the markets here in Virginia and North Carolina. The markets being primarily energy utilities that are going to use it in their and to generate electricity, and also to private companies that use it for the same purpose, for powering their equipment and that sort of thing.
So it's a pipeline. Natural gas has been with us for centuries. Why the controversy?
A couple of reasons. One is that there's a strong voice out there among environmentalists and some citizens that we should really go all the way on clean energy, and they would like to see us use wind and solar energy instead of gas to power our electric plants. The other concerns about it right now are that it does go across the environment. It goes through the Appalachian Mountains, through national forests right now, and it goes, they're taking, people's land to go across that, and people are really concerned about what it's going to do to the environment. And the permits that have to be issued by the federal government to let this happen are what's at issue right now.
So, Lisa, this thing is scheduled to go through 8 counties, through 300 waterways in North Carolina, through the most intact conservation landscape in the southeast. Aside from the fact that they would be disturbing that landscape as they built the pipeline, are there concerns about what the pipeline contains, about how it might leak, or is it strictly This is going through virgin territory, so to speak.
Right. Well, one of the main concerns is that pipelines leak methane, and methane is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas, even more so than carbon
It's
dioxide.
87 times more potent than carbon dioxide.
Right. And so if you're thinking about climate change, and we have, 12 years to really get that under control, having something that leaks methane into the atmosphere is very problematic. And so you have waterways, you have air emissions, you have environmental justice concerns. So even though eastern North Carolina may not have some of the issues that the terrain issues, for example, in Virginia, there are very, very serious questions about this. And also people are worried about safety. There was just a natural gas pipeline explosion in Ohio. So they're rightfully so. They have many environmental and public safety concerns.
Just to add one more thing, you mentioned methane, Lisa. Another place that's an issue is right at the well source. There are those who are pointing to the way that this gas is brought up from the underground and saying that there's big leaks there, and that's an issue that they say is not really being considered in the equation.
Well, I was going to ask about that. If you stop the pipeline, they've already fracked. So where is this gas going at the moment? Is it just seeping out of the ground? Are they burning it off at the source? Where is that methane going right now, as we speak?
It's leaking into the atmosphere.
Okay. So wouldn't it be better to pump it into a pipeline and use it to generate electric power, or to cook with, because that's where it goes to. It goes to our gas stoves.
What we're talking about is not the main stream of gas that they're putting in the pipeline, but stuff that leaks out as part of the process that is not under control.
Right. But nonetheless,
Right.
they're concerned about this pipeline leaking. How often do pipelines like that leak?
They leak often. I mean,
Okay.
that's kind of their nature. I mean, it's not necessarily, off-gassing enormous amounts, but, it's enough. I mean, I would say that by their nature, they leak just like, your house isn't completely airtight. So any amount of methane is incredibly potent, and you don't want it in the air. And I would like to add that I've been to where they've already done some clear cutting in Northampton County and Cumberland County for the pipeline, and it is unfortunately incredibly depressing to see what the environmental damage has been, the clear cutting of
How
the
much
trees.
clear cutting do they have to do? The pipeline is a pipe. And how big is the pipe?
It depends on where it comes in, but it could be as large as 36 inches in diameter.
Okay, so how much-
So they also have a 50 to 100 foot easement and right of way.
Okay.
There's a lot of disturbance of the ground, and they have to take the trees out, and then they have to maintain that with herbicides to keep the vegetation from growing down into the pipeline. So it's an enormous undertaking.
Don't they also have to do the clear cutting for high tension power lines?
Yes,
Isn't
they
there
do.
isn't there a drawback for any kind of energy production?
There are. It's a big equation. What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? And right now, the energy companies like Duke Energy are making the argument that natural gas is cleaner than coal, and that certainly is true when you look at the emissions from it at the power plant. But the environmental groups are saying, well, let's look at all the other factors here, including these methane emissions at the source of the gas and all the other pieces to it. It still comes out on balance that this is a cleaner way to generate energy.
And the Southern Environmental Law Center, which has been fighting all this all along, last year cited risks to water quality. Why? You're the Catawba River keeper, and maybe this is not exactly your area of expertise because the pipeline's not going through the Catawba. But what water quality issues might there be? Just from construction?
There's obviously some issues when you're constructing a pipeline. So we're talking about a 100 to 200 foot easement, part of it going through National Forest, the Appalachian Trail, things like that. So as they clear cut those areas, you have runoff and herbicides are sprayed down. Additionally, when you're actually fracking the gas up, you're going to have this hydraulic byproduct. And depending on which state and where you're at, there's different ways to store that. Sometimes it does leak into the water table. Sometimes it does spill off into streams and is discharged.
This construction runoff, which is it happens anytime you disturb the environment, I suppose. That's only temporary, isn't it? Or would that continue for years to come?
Let me jump in here and say that whenever you clear cut an area that's now forest,
Right.
you're creating an environmental issue with runoff. And I've written about this in other situations, including deforestation in North Carolina that's related to the wood pellet industry, which is another energy-related topic that we've talked about. But anyway, anytime you cut down a large swath of forest, you're changing the way that water drains, and you're changing the natural protections that are there from runoff.
So we have the concerns about methane seepage at the well source in West Virginia. We have concerns about environmental damage to the areas through which this pipeline would have to run, and the construction process and clear cutting and herbicides and all that running off into water, which causes water problems. And then we have the concerns, I'm told, by environmentalists that allowing natural gas to be increased as a producer of electricity simply delays moving to cleaner forms of energy like wind and solar. How big a concern is that in all of this and in the delays that have already taken place? Lisa.
Well, I think that, for example, when you have a $7 billion project and let's just say that it's built, you've locked yourself into an enormous investment for probably 40 years. So if you could take $7 billion, and this is being reductionist, but let's just say you could take that and put it toward battery storage or better wind turbines or some other kind of advanced solar technology, then you are misplacing, in my opinion, the resources that could be used for cleaner energy. So one of the other things that is worth noting is that the explosion of these, not literal explosion, but the proliferation of these pipelines is because they get a 14% rate of return. That was established by FERC many years ago. And so there's an incentive to build these pipelines rather than to go clean.
We don't really have a good, solid national energy policy. We haven't had one for years. But as Lisa says, it's decisions like that kind of guide the energy companies in one direction. Their argument for this is not only is this cleaner burning, but it's cheaper at the moment. I mean, coal has gotten very expensive, and natural gas is a lot cheaper, and the price has been pretty steady for a while now. And that helps to keep energy prices low, which is another goal of the energy companies and energy regulators.
But doesn't solar and wind keep energy prices low given the fact that solar and wind are free at the source?
I mean, the argument about the cost of solar, I mean, at this point, the equipment that you need to run solar is pretty inexpensive. The capital investment is a big solar farm could be roughly about the investment of a gas plant, for example. Okay. And so the cost of the sunlight obviously is free, or the wind, or whatever it is. So I think in that respect it could be, and that's what the environmental groups are trying to persuade the energy companies of. But they make another argument, which is that the gas plants that we're talking about generating electricity, they're being used to generate the electricity that we need consistently every day. That's called the base load.
Right.
And what the energy companies say is that, the wind and sun are not consistent. And so we need sources that are there all the time. Now, there are technologies out there like battery storage, which Lisa just mentioned, which could help to alleviate some of that. But we're not all the way there yet.
I was going to say, gas is here, but battery storage, solar power, wind power, isn't that still in the developmental stage? And if you buy a big battery to store things, by next year, won't it be obsolete?
Well, you have to make an investment in what you have right now, and certainly the companies can look at the timeline for that and say it makes sense. They are starting to deploy batteries here in North Carolina, Duke Energy is, and I think we're going to see more in the future.
David Borax is with WFAE News. Lisa Sorg is an environmental reporter with NC Policy Watch, and Brandon Jones is with us. He's the new Catawba Riverkeeper. We'll talk more about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline when we come back. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Catawba College Salisbury, where 96% of graduates leave college either with a job or with acceptance into graduate school. Catawba College, whose mission is to transform, inspire, and help students belong. Catawba.edu. As you all know, we have just come out of a partial government shutdown, partial because some parts of the government remained open, including the national parks, but during the longest shutdown in history, those parks experienced vandalism, trash piled up, trees were cut down by visitors, and 7 people died in those parks. As the government reopens and parks return to 100% staffing, we look at the state of North Carolina's national parks tomorrow on this program at 9.
America's longest government shutdown ever is over. But the damage from the stalemate is expected to last for many weeks, and there's no guarantee that those affected won't face being furloughed again. Putting the government back to work. Next time on 1A.
1A coming up next after Charlotte Talks at 10. Here on Listener Funded 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
It's Charlotte Talks on Listener Funded, 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about several environmental issues, and we're starting with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which was given a permit and approved by state legislatures and the state legislature in a bipartisan manner last year because the Cooper administration signed off on it, as did the Republican-controlled legislature. But now things have slowed down, and there are machinations going on in the courts. In fact, there has been a string of victories by opponents taking place in the courts, the latest of which came in December when the federal court invalidated the permit. That stopped everything. Does that invalidate the permit in perpetuity? Is there a workaround for this that the three utilities are trying to come up with? Where does that stand, David?
Well, we're talking about a series of permits, and really there's two right now that are at issue. One is from the Forest Service, and the other is from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the Fish and Wildlife Service permit really seems to be the one that's the big holdup at the minute. But both of those either are on appeal now by the company, or they plan to appeal. And what these do is they put a roadblock up right now, and they need to be renegotiated or reworked out to a point that the court will approve. This is one court that's doing this. It's the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond, and these are cases that have made their way through the federal courts. And, we're waiting to see if there's any kind of a workaround that they can come up with that will satisfy the courts on this. And it's not really clear if there is one.
So there have been several rulings over the last several months, and taken together, experts say that these federal court rulings suggest a permitting and approval process that was hasty and possibly misguided. That's a quote. And a lawyer for the Southern Environmental Law Center characterizes actions by those building the pipeline as, quote, arrogant and counting on bullying state agencies to get it through. Any evidence of that, Lisa?
Well, bullying is strong, but I think that the person from the Southern Environmental Law Center probably has evidence to back that up. I think that there was a lot of pressure on that we know now from on the governor's side to get this through. Just in terms of the federal process, they had this incredibly protracted environmental impact statement and public comment period, but after many revisions, that document, the environmental impact statement, still had multiple questions, and it felt to me, I read it, and there were a lot of gaps, and I think we're now seeing the result of a really poor environmental impact statement that was issued by FERC, and now that's what we're living with. And so I think the SELC is right in that there was an enormous amount of pressure. These are very, very powerful energy companies. They put pressure on the executive branch, they put pressure on the legislative branch, and I'm sure they put pressure on FERC to just get it done.
How long will this current ruling, the one that's stopped all forward progress, how long is this likely to stop it? It stops it in perpetuity until the utilities can win a court case? So
there's two things that can happen. One is they could try and figure out a new permit that satisfies the court. The other is that they're appealing it. They're saying the court got it wrong when they put a hold on the Fish and Wildlife permit. And so the first thing that will really happen will be it will go through this appeal process. And there will be also an appeal on the forestry permit as well.
So again, these three utilities are Duke Energy and its subsidiary Piedmont Natural Gas, the Southern Company of Georgia, and Dominion Energy of Virginia, which also operates in North Carolina. And they appear to be the leader here, if I'm not mistaken. They say that there will be painful consequences for this delay. And they point to 4,500 construction workers on the project who will be idled and increase costs to build the project as delays push it, the completion date further out. If this project is completed, who will pay for these additional costs? Ratepayers or stockholders?
It's a good question.
Well,
go ahead, Lisa.
I was just going to say, I think, there will be some, it depends on the Utilities Commission here in North Carolina who will have to bear the larger burden, but the ratepayers will be on the hook for at least some of it. That's for sure.
Okay. Natural gas projects are facing challenges not just here but nationwide by those who want to keep the gas in the ground. But this is not only a cleaner fuel than coal, it's considered to be this so-called bridge fuel to get us from coal to cleaner forms and more sustainable forms of energy. Once those other forms can produce the kind of power that we need as demand increases. But will solar or wind ever be able to accomplish that? Ever? Because the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. Won't we always need nuclear or water or natural gas or coal to generate electricity?
I think we will need some kind of a base load, as Duke Energy says. I mean, that's looking at our system as it is currently configured. We have a centralized energy system where everything is produced in one place, whether it be a coal-fired power plant, a nuclear plant, or a large solar farm. It's all done in one place and distributed out to people who need it and companies that need it. You know, there's another kind of an energy system you could have, which would be a more localized one or community-based one, where it wouldn't depend on these big projects.
But wouldn't that have to be solar or wind, those projects? Because you can't put natural gas or coal-fired power plants or nuclear power plants every 20 miles.
That's right. It would be more. It would be renewable energy, and presumably you would have battery storage attached to that, and you would be able to answer some of those questions about what happens when the sun's not shining.
Where's the technology for that right now?
The technology exists. The cost of the technology is still coming down, but it's getting closer to what you might consider to be something part of a modern energy system. I think right now, you know, going back to my discussion about the model, a large energy company that produces centrally has to work on keeping its costs down. And, you know, in a different scenario like I'm talking about where it's localized, it just all that breaks down because they have money that they've invested over the years in all of these older plants, and they've gotten permission from regulators to charge us to pay for that. If people start dropping off the energy grid and doing it locally, who pays for that?
And Virginia and North Carolina residents are living in an area that's growing rapidly, and therefore demand, it would seem, for electricity is growing rapidly as well. But the Virginia State Corporation Commission has already rejected Dominion Energy's estimate of future demand for gas, saying it was inflated. What is the need right now, here in North Carolina, for instance?
Well,
Do we know?
figures that I've seen have the expansion that is being alleged a bit overblown, that it's more flat. Especially one thing we haven't talked about is energy efficiency.
Okay.
And that
That's
also
rising.
reduces the demand. When you have more energy efficient appliances or you can weatherize homes, that may sound like a small thing, but it adds up. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's not something that is isolated, whether it will just be solar, just be wind, just be energy efficiency. But together, I think that the demand for electricity could be met. I mean, it is going to take a real investment, but like I said earlier, $7 billion would go a long way to developing battery storage to meet those needs. And the other thing we didn't talk about is that tying in to the pipeline, if you're an industry, that tie-in cost is millions of dollars. So this isn't just like you plug in and you have gas. There is a serious capital cost for the companies that want to hook into this line.
And who would those companies be, aside from Dominion Resources or Dominion Energy and Duke Power?
Perhaps a untold yet manufacturing company or something like that. I mean, if you're thinking that's going to draw manufacturing, I'm not sure that natural gas will do that alone. And manufacturing is not something that, you know, that's an industry of another time.
So Julie on Facebook writes, if we are going to continue to use natural gas, pipelines are far safer than other transportation methods. Today, much of the natural gas is being transported by rail with lines closer to major population centers. Rail transport is much riskier safety-wise than pipeline transfer. That would seem to be true on the face of it, is it?
You know, I couldn't answer that question. I haven't looked into this issue, but safety is certainly an issue. And, you know, getting the gas to the places where it's needed, let's go back to what this is. This is a large pipeline. This is the main line.
Right.
Once we start hooking up businesses, as Lisa said, there'll be lots of smaller pipelines built off of this one. And so think of it as this is the artery, and we have to build all the smaller vessels to get there.
So this pipeline starts in West Virginia, and it goes to eastern North Carolina. And the route it's taking is through all these protected areas, these natural areas. If this ruling by the court stands, the pipeline would have no approval to go through the Appalachian Trail or these national forests. So where would they go? What are their options? Do they have alternative routes?
So I've talked to the company Dominion about this, and they don't really answer the question right away. I mean, other than going around it would be thousands of miles and billions more dollars.
So they're going to appeal this, as you've already said. Do they have precedent on their side? Because there are 56 other oil and natural gas pipelines that have been operating for years that cross the Appalachian Trail.
That's their argument. Their argument is that the court erred when it ruled that this permit was invalid, and I think they're sticking it all on that.
Okay. If the power companies are successful in getting this thing built, what's the projected completion date for this project? When will it be supplying gas to power companies? And what are the power companies projecting the result of their success to be?
They're looking at this. This is a business that's been set up to try and supply gas, and I think the original completion date was 2020, and they're warning that if these permits are not approved in a short term here, that will push back the start date for this. Dominion Energy has already put out a statement saying it will reduce its earnings, its profits, looking forward, because it won't be starting as quickly as expected. Duke Energy hasn't put out any numbers about it, but they're promising us that when they announce their earnings in February, they will talk about the impact of these delays. I think bottom line is the companies still believe that this will get built, and their projections are all going to be based on that. And it may be some optimism on their part. The court battle here could be longer than they expect. Obviously, folks who oppose this are hoping that this is the death knell.
Was Lisa, had none of these objections come up and they were able to just build this thing as planned, was the plan to lower electricity rates or simply to expand capacity?
Well, I think they would argue that both. I'm not sure that either was accurate. I mean, it would expand capacity to whom, we're not sure. And also, one thing that was, I believe it was a year and a half ago, maybe almost 2 years, Dominion announced that it would actually extend this into South Carolina. So that has raised some questions of whether there is additional, the demand is not what it seems in North Carolina, that they're expanding it into South Carolina to have more demand. So that is another question, is when it goes into South Carolina, where will it go?
There are environmental concerns with all energy production and consumption. Every one of them. There's not all of them. Even people have objections to solar because birds run into the windmills. So there are environmental concerns to everything. Which is worse here? The potential for leaks of methane from this natural gas pipeline going through all these natural areas, or the pipeline not getting built at all, and these power companies relying on more traditional forms of power generation like coal. Which hurts the environment more?
I don't think they'll go back to coal. I think that's a non-starter.
Okay. Is this thing going to get built? What do you think?
I think it's a toss-up right now. It depends on how tightly the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals holds to those rulings. I think it'll end up at the Supreme Court, and we will decide then.
Before we move on to coal ash, this is a good transition question from Dennis in Mooresville, which is, he says, is home to the Marshall Steam Plant coal ash pond. Doesn't using batteries for electrical storage and delivery pose similar disposal problems to coal ash or spent nuclear rods? It seems that other than wind and sunshine-generated power, disposal always presents environmental concerns. What? Because batteries have a lifetime. They have a life period, a life span. What happens when you have to dispose of these batteries?
Yeah, we're just at the beginning of the battery era here. It's going to be an issue at the end of life of those batteries. But let's go back to when they first started using coal and began dumping coal into these ponds. There was no discussion at that time about what do we do with this stuff when it starts leaching into the groundwater. We didn't really even think of that. In fact, you could order up a truckload of coal ash and have it put into your yard as fill.
But we're smarter
We're
today.
smarter now, and
Yeah.
I think that one thing that needs to happen is they need to think about the life cycle of the batteries and incorporate that into thinking right now, so that up front, that's a cost that's built into it. And we'll see if we do that or not.
So we've been talking about coal ash. Let's transition to that at various and coal ash removal at various Duke Energy plants for years. Recently, more than 500 people packed into a school gym in Catawba County. I know you were there, David, for this. It wasn't supposed to be a public meeting. It was kind of a meet and greet, gather around tables, look at literature, have your questions asked and answered one-on-one. But it quickly turned into an opportunity for raucous, passionate discussion. Let's put it that way. The people there wanted to talk about 3 cleanup options for the nearby Marshall plant and the removal of 17 tons of coal ash. Have there been problems with coal ash storage at the Marshall plant?
So the measurements that Duke Energy takes, it's required to do tests all the time, and they say that the coal ash there has not leached into the water supply or into Lake Norman or anything. I think there's folks who would dispute that, but the official record is that. There is a concern right now in South Iredell County about thyroid cancer. There's a cluster of thyroid cancer there, and that came up at this meeting, which, by the way, all 3 of us, Brandon, Lisa, and I, were all there at that meeting. But that occupied 30 minutes of discussion at that meeting about the cancer cluster that's there and whether it was related to coal ash. And the official word is that there haven't been any studies that show a direct connection between the components of coal ash and thyroid cancer. That doesn't mean it's not there, but we don't have anything official to show us that.
Did that impromptu meeting, that spring up meeting a couple of weeks ago, predate or did it follow the state mandating that Duke Energy close all of its coal ash sites, including the one at Marshall?
It followed that.
It followed that.
And I would also like to point out that they have already documented groundwater contamination at all the sites in North Carolina.
All of them.
All of them.
What's the timetable for the closing of these ponds? And when we say closing, what does that mean?
That's the debate, isn't it? I did a story a couple of years ago asking people their opinions on this, and it's the 2 opinions are closing means digging it up and getting it out of where it is right now. Duke Energy's argument is that closing can include putting a waterproof cover over it and making sure that it's no longer permeable to water. And the first solution there would absolutely get it out of the way and remove it from near waterways where it typically is located. Duke's solution doesn't answer the question about what about the coal ash that's already there, which may be seeping the components into the groundwater there.
Groundwater is everywhere. So if you move this stuff someplace else, and even if you put it into a lined ditch, does that completely prevent seepage into groundwater? Very quickly, Brandon.
That is the best available technology we have right now.
Okay, we're going to come back and talk about alternatives to moving this stuff, to getting rid of it, and the meaning of capping it versus moving it, and what that would mean to water quality. And when we come back, we're here with David Borax, Brandon Jones, and Lisa Sorg. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members of the Charlotte Symphony, presenting Pink Martini, part big band, part classical ensemble, performing a blend of covers and multilingual original songs. February 1st and 2nd at Belk Theater. Info at charlottesymphony.org. Coming up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A, President Trump ventured into the Rose Garden on Friday to announce the partial government shutdown was over until February 15th. With federal workers headed back to the job today and clocks ticking in Congress, what can we expect ahead of the February 15th deadline? What will the lasting effects of the shutdown be? They'll be talking about that with Joshua Johnson and his guests in 20 minutes on 1A. We will continue our conversation about environmental issues throughout North Carolina in just a moment. Stay with us.
Celebrate WFAE, the season of love, and all things chocolate. Friday, February 15th at the Charlotte Museum of History. Enjoy chocolates, chocolate desserts, and other chocolate-inspired items from area chocolatiers, bakeries, wineries, and others. proceeds from this decadent event will benefit WFAE. Tickets and information at WFAE.org. Chocolate is sponsored by SunTrust.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about environmental concerns in North Carolina. We started with talking about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. We've moved on to our most popular topic of all time when it comes to the environment, coal ash. And we're here with David Borax, WFAE's environmental reporter, Lisa Sorg, environmental reporter with NC Policy Watch, and Brandon Jones, the relatively new Catawba River keeper. There are coal ash storage areas all over the state. They have been filling with coal ash, which is, of course, the waste product from burning coal, for more than a century in some cases. How many incidents have there been over all that time of these places where water or other environmental damage is being done because of the presence of coal ash?
Let me just jump in and say, well, how do you define incidents? In North Carolina, everybody may have heard about the Dan River accident a few years back where coal ash from a pond there started leaking into the Dan River, and that's the largest accident that we've had in North Carolina. That some people would say that's it. We've had one major incident like that. But if you count the hundreds and thousands of small leaks from these coal ash ponds over the years, I don't even know how many there are.
So explain, Lisa, to me why it is that the federal government insists, or not, maybe insist is too strong a word, they have never classified coal ash as a toxic substance, and yet it has heavy metals in it that are toxic. Why isn't this considered a toxic substance by the federal government?
Well, the energy companies had a lot to say about that. There was a lot of political lobbying, and so the EPA, under enormous amount of pressure, decided to classify it as non-hazardous. So
does that make discussion of this with people who are not scientists difficult, because there seems to be some, quote, disagreement about whether or not this stuff is harmful?
Right. Well, if you talk to Duke Energy, you will hear them talk about how this is non-hazardous and use that as a talking point. And it's our job as journalists and people who are informed citizens to push back on that and say, well, arsenic and cadmium and cobalt and beryllium and thallium, which are all found in coal ash, chromium-6, are individually hazardous. And so to call it non-hazardous is purely semantical and is greenwashing and some very creative wordsmithing. I looked up the Allen plant, which will be the topic of tomorrow night's meeting, and they had their latest groundwater. I guess it was last year. Duke Energy released 20,000 pages of groundwater data, and there were 9 pollutants underneath those ponds, and some of them were astronomically high in very hazardous pollutants. So non-hazardous is like I said, just greenwashing.
So, Brandon, coal ash is a byproduct of burning coal. I would think if it has all these nasty things in it, those nasty things are also in coal.
Correct.
So it comes out of the ground, because coal's in the ground. It gets burnt in a power plant. It goes back to the ground. If coal has all this stuff in it, and coal ash has all this stuff in it, what's the difference? We can't take all the coal out of the earth, and if we did, where would we put it? So what's the difference in the environmental impact?
Sure. Well, when we burn the coal, like I said, we have this coal ash left over. And what happens is some parts of the coal, like the carbon dioxide or the carbon, are burned off, but the rest of it starts to become concentrated. So the coal ash has concentrated levels of these different carcinogens and toxins and heavy metals, et cetera. And then in these unlined pits right beside our waterways, they're stored in water. And so the water will naturally flow through that and then pick up some of these metals and then go into the groundwater and then into our surface
And
waterways.
in North Carolina, at least, these coal ash ponds are near waterways because power plants were located near waterways because they were using water to cool the power plants. And so they just stored the coal ash on site. These coal ash ponds were not necessarily lined from the beginning because we didn't know the environmental impact at the time 100 years ago. Is that right?
Sure. And they weren't required to be lined, so they aren't lined.
So if you dig this stuff up, and we'll talk about how long that would take, but if you dig this stuff up and you put it someplace else, we don't want it. Who does?
The concrete industry, mainly.
And is there enough demand for the supply of coal ash that we have?
We are currently importing coal ash from India and China.
What?
Yes.
Then why aren't we using the coal ash that we have?
It does have to be reprocessed because we have higher air quality standards here in America. It has elevated levels of carbon in it, so it can't be used right off the bat as coal ash or as concrete filler. But it can be recycled. That's what they're doing in South Carolina. That's what Duke's been required to do at 2 of the plants in North Carolina, and that's what they're pushing for in Virginia as well.
So if you put it into concrete, correct me if I'm wrong, the concrete encapsulates the bad stuff so it can't leach out. Is that always the case?
Right, and
What if there's a crack in the concrete?
we're also diluting it again, so it's not 1-to-1 concrete to coal ash.
So how expensive is the reprocessing of this stuff so that it becomes as useful, if that's the right word, as the stuff we're shipping in from India to use in concrete?
That depends on who's doing it, who you ask.
So Duke is required by the state to build 2 of these and then probably a third one later. My question to Duke was, why not do this at every place? And I think a lot, as with almost everything about this topic, it all comes down to cost. I think it costs a few $100 million to build one of these recycling facilities. It would probably, the supply of coal ash that's available from those plants there's probably 20 years worth of coal ash for recycling there. Why not send some coal ash from other locations to these? Well, then you have that issue of trucking it or sending it by train to these recycling facilities. Ultimately, it comes down to how much it would cost to do all of that.
How is South Carolina able to do it?
For one thing, there are fewer plants there and a smaller amount of coal ash. So I think that's one thing. But, this problem is it's the same all around North Carolina. I mean, the question is open about why not do it that way.
So at the Marshall plant, Brandon, Duke Energy is proposing to put a waterproof cover over the coal ash pit. A lot of people are opposed to that. What are the dangers of doing that? What does that accomplish, in fact?
Well, for all these sites, they're going to have to dewater first. So that's getting the water out of the coal ash.
And where does that water go?
It's
evaporated?
It will be treated according to Duke's NPDES permit, which is their pollution discharge elimination system permit, and then discharged into the lake. Now, unfortunately, for some of their permits, they don't have a cap on how much arsenic, for example, they're allowed to discharge. So we'll be pushing for them to monitor that carefully. But once the water has been discharged, then they will move it and then cap it in place. And Duke is saying that they're just basically going to put a liner over the top of it and then leave it. But that will leave the part of the coal ash that's currently in the water table exposed to groundwater, which will continue to move laterally.
So the water will seep up from underneath and cause it to
It will
leach
just
out.
be moving sideways because the coal ash is currently already below the groundwater table.
Really?
Yes.
Well, then isn't that foolish to even bother to cap it? Does it really accomplish anything in your mind?
It would decrease some of the pollution, but it's very expensive, and you're still going to have continued pollution.
Go ahead.
I was going to say Duke makes a couple of arguments about this. One is that, first of all, they say any method that they use here is going to be safe because, all of these are based on the idea that coal ash is not hazardous. But they also think that leaving it in place is not going to be the worst thing because they don't think that the groundwater is moving in directions that other people think it is. So if you look at the wells around it, they have these charts with arrows on them, and the arrows all point to flows that go away from community wells and people's wells.
What's your take on that? Does groundwater move? Because it seems to me that when we were at the height of the drought several years ago, people were saying about all of our groundwater is going away. Well, obviously we've had a lot of moisture in the last couple of years. That groundwater is being replenished. That would seem that the molecules would be moving and therefore the water would be moving. Am I wrong?
Groundwater does move, and generally towards our bodies, our surface waters. So generally, it will be moving towards the lake. With these coal ash ponds, that Allen one, for example, is about 80 feet above the lake. Mm-hmm. And so when you have this elevated pressure, that water was moving out in all directions, back towards local wells. And we see that in many cases.
So a lot of people want this stuff removed. And Duke points out that it would take 15 years and $200 million to remove the water at the storage pits at Marshall and then place the protected cap over it. But it would take 32 years of dump trucks working 24/7 to remove completely the 16.8 million tons of ash from Marshall at a cost of $1 billion. Where would they take that material if that's that's the route they choose to take? Where would you suggest they put that stuff?
In a lined landfill on site. So they have room on the property, and this is part of their proposal, to build a proper lined landfill.
What do they
on-site.
line it with?
I believe it's about a 6 or 9 millimeter thick plastic piece. It's the same thing we use for our industrial landfills. And then below that, you've got
How thick
clay.
how thick is that in English?
Let's see, what would that be? About
Thicker than a trash bag?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, significantly.
All right, like a piece of leather?
Probably thicker than that because they're also going to have compacted clay beneath that, and they're
Okay.
also going to have monitoring wells all around
And
it.
is this the kind of plastic that does not deteriorate over time?
All plastics have a lifespan.
Yes.
But this
and then
one,
what happens?
Unfortunately, and I don't know what the lifespan, probably at least 100 years, they're going to have to deal with that.
Why wouldn't they encapsulate it in the concrete that they make from the coal ash?
That's a great question. We would like them to do that.
Oh, you would?
Yes. That was the preferred method, is to put this into concrete or other beneficial reuse like that.
If in the best of all possible worlds you'd like to see all this removed, it would take, by their estimate, 17 extra years to do this. In those 17 extra years, is it worth the potential for environmental damage to take that route?
We already have environmental damage. It's currently seeping into the groundwater and contaminating the groundwater, and that's documented. This is Duke's forecast, and it has currently not been vetted by any outside departments, including our own Department of Environmental Quality. And so, perhaps the numbers are inflated, perhaps they're not. But a third party should be looking at this and doing their own assessment.
So that's just one plant. That's just the Marshall plant. And last year, David, we talked about the fact that tons of coal ash is being taken every day from the Riverbend steam station in Gaston County to be recycled. Where and does that continue?
Actually, the Riverbend plant is being excavated. It was one of 4 around the state that the state legislature wrote into the law that should be required to be excavated. And that is being taken to a new landfill that's being built. It's not being recycled. It's being taken to a new lined landfill in an old brick mine up in Chatham County, which is in central North Carolina. Interestingly enough, the folks around that landfill don't want it there either. But nonetheless, it's happening. And I think there are 3 different plants are sending their coal ash there, and that will be buried. And actually, the story about the Riverbend plant is that they are done over there right now, and they're landscaping it so that you can't even tell it was there anymore. But
and
now the problem is transferred to this Brookhaven mine.
And when you were reporting on the unscheduled town hall meeting at Catawba County, a mention was made, and I think it's been made by Brandon this morning, of this unexplained spike in thyroid cancer cases in South Iredell County. Do people believe that comes from the coal ash? Is there any way to prove that?
So people are raising that question. The citizens are raising that question. Local elected officials are looking into it. As I said, the experts say that there's not any established link, but it doesn't mean that there isn't one. But it is another one of those things that goes along with this issue. I don't know if my colleagues here have any thoughts on thyroid cancer linked to coal ash.
Well, there are
Go ahead,
tests
Lisa.
going on right now. Heather Stapleton at Duke University is doing an exhaustive test of the inside of people's homes and ground or drinking water, and that study's ongoing. I think it's up to 50 enrollees now, and then Virginia Tech is going to come in and start testing private wells, because the folks on Lake Norman are on their own on private wells. They're not on a public water system. So I think within the next year, 18 months, we're going to start seeing some science come out of this. That doesn't mean it will prove causation or correlation, but at least we'll have a better grip on what's really in the environment.
So there's a meeting tomorrow night, as you've mentioned, at 6 at Stewart W. Kramer High in Cramerton, hosted by the Department of Environmental Quality, about the Allen Steam Station. Already, Duke advised residents several years ago not to drink the water there, and then the state reversed that ruling, but Duke, I think, supplied them water anyway, which is a good indication that the groundwater has been, because people were using wells there, that the groundwater was contaminated. If it wasn't from the coal ash, they say it was from naturally occurring materials in the ground. Is that possible?
It is possible, technically, because these are elements. They do occur naturally. The levels that we saw were much higher than what we expect to see in that area.
Yeah.
and Duke out of goodwill supplied them with water.
What do you expect out of this meeting tomorrow night?
So I think it'll probably go a lot like the Marshall meeting went, where the residents are turning up and demanding to be heard on this. As you mentioned at the beginning, the idea originally was you'd go around to stations, kind of like a science fair. I think that's Lisa's description there. It was kind of like a science fair, and you could ask questions. But I'm not sure if they're making plans to do it any differently here, but I expect there will be a lot of people who want to be heard.
So we have a minute left, and I want to get to solar because you reported recently, David, that 2,000 property owners applied for about 1,300 solar rebates in 2019. For the second year in a row, all the rebates available for solar installations were snapped up in about 2 days this time and about 2 weeks last time, which means there's an increasing demand. But does that mean there's not enough money for solar rebates to meet the demand of people who want to go to solar power?
So Duke is supplying this money. It's about $10 million a year, and they're doing it because they were required by the state to do it. And the $10 million is clearly, based on the demand, not enough. I heard from somebody else that it was probably closed out on the same day that they opened it. So there's clearly more demand. Will Duke make more money available? Probably not, unless they're required to do so. So
this money comes from Duke.
It does.
So what you're saying is just because the demand increases doesn't mean that they're going to be opening their pocketbooks.
That's all there is, and there ain't no more.
Okay. David Borax, environmental reporter with WFAE News. Lisa Sorg joined us from the studios of WUNC in Durham, environmental reporter with NC Policy Watch. And Brandon Jones, the first of what we'll probably assume will be many visits to this program. He is the new Catawba River Keeper. Thank you all for the hour.
Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins is a production of 90.7 WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from Mazda of South Charlotte. Our production staff includes